Story: The Ghost Signal of Mount Asahi. A true story of the unexplained. The world is full of empty spaces. We look at a map and see named peaks, charted rivers, and designated trails, and we fool ourselves into believing we have tamed it. We think we understand the wilderness, but go deep enough, far enough away from the reassuring hum of civilization, and you discover the truth. The map is a lie. The names are just whispers against an ancient, indifferent silence. And sometimes, in that silence, something answers back. This is a story about such a place. The Daisetsuzan volcanic group in Hokkaido, Japan. A place of breathtaking, brutal beauty, known to the indigenous Ainu people as Kamui Mintara, the playground of the gods. In the summer of 1989, this playground became a stage for a mystery so profound, so deeply unsettling, that it continues to echo through the decades. It's a story of a rescue, a tragedy, and a signal from nowhere. A giant, desperate plea that remains an orphan to this day. This is the story of the Daisetsuzan SOS incident. Part 1, The Vanishing. July 21st, 1989. The air in central Hokkaido was thick with the promise of a perfect summer day. For two friends from Tokyo, Kenji Iwamura and Koichi Kudo, it was the start of an adventure they had planned for months. Both were experienced outdoorsmen, not reckless youths. They were men in their late 20s, office workers who found their true selves in the rugged embrace of the mountains. Daisetsuzan National Park was their prize, a sprawling expanse of alpine meadows, volcanic steam vents, and jagged peaks crowned by Mount Asahi, the highest point in Hokkaido. Their plan was meticulous, as one would expect from seasoned hikers. They would ascend Mount Asahi via the standard route, and then traverse a challenging ridgeback trail towards the Black Dake Kurodake peak. It was a 2-day trek, well within their capabilities. They packed their gear with care. Tents, sleeping bags, rations for 3 days just in case, a small radio, and, fatefully, a cassette tape recorder. For Kenji, the recorder was a way to capture the sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, the rush of wind through the dwarf pines, perhaps a personal audio diary of their journey. On the morning of the 21st, they signed the climber's registry at the base of the Asahidake ropeway. Their names, written in neat script, were a promise. Kenji Iwamura, Koichi Kudo. Destination, Kurodake. Expected return, July 23rd. They smiled for a final photo, their faces bright with anticipation, the formidable silhouette of Mount Asahi looming behind them like a silent god. Then, they stepped onto the trail and vanished from the known world. The 23rd came and went. The space next to their names in the return log remained blank. By the 24th, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in the stomachs of their families back in Tokyo. Calls were made. The park authorities were notified. By midday, the familiar and dreaded protocols of a search and rescue operation ground into motion. The Hokkaido Prefectural Police are no strangers to lost hikers. Daisetsuzan is vast, over 2,200 square kilometers of raw, untamed land. Its beauty is a mask for its treachery. The weather can turn in an instant. A sunny afternoon dissolving into a fog so thick you can't see your own hands. A simple misstep can send a hiker tumbling into a ravine hidden by dense thickets of sasa, the notoriously tough, head-high bamboo grass that carpets the mountainsides. The initial search was a textbook operation. Ground teams, composed of police and local volunteer mountaineers, began sweeping the planned route. They moved with a practiced, somber efficiency, their calls of "Iwamura-san," "Kudo-san," swallowed by the immense landscape. They found nothing. No footprints off the main trail, no discarded gear, no sign of a struggle or an accident. It was as if the two men had simply been erased. As the first day of the search bled into the second, a sense of urgency began to curdle into dread. A helicopter was dispatched, its rotors chopping through the thin mountain air. From above, the scale of the challenge was terrifyingly clear. The park was a rumpled green and gray blanket stretching to the horizon. Finding two men in that vastness was like searching for two specific grains of sand on an endless beach. The pilot, Captain Yamazaki, had flown hundreds of these missions. He knew the grim calculus of exposure. In the mountains, Time is a merciless enemy. He scanned the landscape with a trained eye, looking for a flash of color from a backpack, the glint of metal, any anomaly in the natural tapestry below. For hours, there was only the mountain. Then, on the afternoon of July 25th, something changed. Flying over a southern slope of Mount Asahi, far from the route the hikers were supposed to have taken, Yamazaki's co-pilot shouted, pointing, "Down there, to the right." Yamazaki banked the helicopter sharply, and then he saw it. It was impossible. It was perfect, and it was enormous. Carved into the mountainside, arranged with an almost architectural precision, were 3 massive letters, each nearly 20 feet tall, constructed from 19 huge, stripped birch logs. So's hope surged through the cockpit, electric and blinding. It was a signal, a sign of life. The logs were huge, clearly the work of desperate, determined people. They had to be Iwamura and Kudo. The ground teams were immediately redirected. Rescue was imminent. The helicopter descended, the downdraft flattening the surrounding bamboo grass. As they drew closer, a figure emerged from the tree line, stumbling towards the clearing, waving his arms frantically. He was thin, haggard, his clothes torn. A rescuer was lowered on a winch. He clipped the survivor into a harness, and they were lifted back into the humming belly of the machine. The man was safe. He was alive. But as he collapsed onto the floor of the helicopter, gasping for breath, the first crack in the foundation of their hope appeared. The rescuer looked at the man's face, gaunt and sunburnt, and checked the photos of the missing hikers. A cold wave of confusion washed over him. This wasn't Kenji Iwamura, and it wasn't Koichi Kudo. They had found someone, but it was the wrong man, and the mystery, which they thought was solved, had only just begun. Part 2, The Ghost Signal. The man they rescued was named Shinya Kawamura. He was a 26-year-old office worker from Chiba, and he too had been lost. He'd been wandering for 2 days after getting separated from his own hiking party on a completely different trail. Exhausted and disoriented, he had been following a stream when he stumbled upon the clearing. He looked up, and there it was, the giant SOS. In the debriefing room at the Asahikawa police station, his story only deepened the enigma. The officers, expecting a straightforward tale of survival, listened with growing bewilderment. "When did you build the sign?" one of them asked, a pen hovering over his notepad. Kawamura looked at them, his eyes wide with exhaustion and confusion. "Build it? I didn't build it. I found it. It was already there." A silence fell over the room. The officers exchanged glances. "What do you mean? It was already there?" The lead investigator pressed. "Those logs are enormous. They weigh hundreds of pounds each. You're telling us you just happened upon it?" "Yes," Kawamura insisted, his voice cracking. I thought whoever made it must be nearby. I shouted for them. I waited. But no one answered. I was too weak to go on, so I stayed. I thought it was my only chance. When I heard your helicopter, I thought you were coming for them." His story was bizarre, but his condition lent it credibility. He was suffering from mild hypothermia and dehydration. He was so weak, he could barely stand. The idea that this man could have felled, stripped, and arranged 19 massive birch logs was ludicrous. It would have been a Herculean task for a team of fresh, strong men, let alone a single starving survivor. The police were now faced with a chilling set of questions. If Kawamura didn't build the sign, who did? And where were they? Was it Iwamura and Kudo, who had somehow managed this incredible feat of engineering before succumbing to the elements or wandering away? But the sign was miles from their intended path. Why would they go so far off course to build it, only to abandon it? The investigation turned its focus back to the sign itself. A forensic team was airlifted to the site. The SOS was even more impressive on the ground. The logs were placed with an almost obsessive neatness. The ground around them was trampled, but there were no clear footprints, no discarded tools, no clues as to the identity or number of its builders. It was a sterile, baffling scene, a massive, screaming message in a vacuum. Local mountaineering experts weighed in. To cut and move those logs would require saws, ropes, and immense physical strength. It was not the work of one person, they concluded. It was likely the work of at least two, possibly more, working over a period of several hours, if not a full day. The search for Iwamura and Kudo intensified, now colored by a strange, almost supernatural dread. The SOS sign, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a tombstone, a monument to a ghost. Had they found a third party? Another victim, or victims, who had built the sign and then vanished into the dense Sasa. The forest held its tongue. For 2 more agonizing days, the search continued. The helicopter crisscrossed the sky. The ground teams pushed deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the distance, a potential clue that dissolved into nothing upon approach. The hope that had flared so brightly with the discovery of the sign was now all but extinguished, replaced by a grim resignation. They were no longer searching for survivors. They were searching for bodies. On July 27th, they found them. A search team, following a faint animal trail about 2 miles northeast of the ghost signal, smelled something. It was the faint, sickly sweet odor of death, a smell that, once known, is never forgotten. They pushed through a final, dense wall of bamboo grass and entered a small, secluded hollow. They lay a few feet from each other, sheltered by a shallow rock overhang. Their bodies showed no signs of trauma from a fall or an animal attack. Their gear was neatly packed in their backpacks nearby. The official cause of death was swift and merciless: hypothermia. They had likely gotten lost in a sudden fog, wandered until they were exhausted, and lay down to rest, a sleep from which they never woke. A common tragic end for so many who challenged the mountains. The case, it seemed, was closed. 2 men got lost. A third man got lost. The third man was found. The first 2 were not. A sad but simple mountain tragedy. Except for one thing: the impossible, screaming, silent thing, the giant SOS made of logs 2 miles away. The timeline made no sense. Iwamura and Kudo were believed to have died on or around July 23rd. The sheer effort required to build the sign would have taken at least a day. Could they have built it, then wandered 2 miles away to die? It seemed illogical. Why expend your last reserves of energy on a massive signal only to immediately abandon it? The police packed up the belongings of the deceased men, including their backpacks. The items would be returned to their grieving families. The case files would be stamped. A tragic but rational explanation entered. But inside Kenji Iwamura's backpack, nestled among his spare clothes and rations, was the small cassette recorder. An officer, following protocol, took it back to the station as evidence. He didn't expect to find anything. Perhaps some recordings of wind or the men chatting on the trail. He sat down in a quiet room, inserted the cassette into a player, and pressed play. What came out of the speakers was not the sound of wind, or birds, or cheerful conversation. What came out was the sound of pure, undiluted terror. Part 3. The voice from the tape. The silence of the evidence room was broken by a hiss of static. For several seconds, that was all there was: the sound of an empty tape. The officer, Sergeant Tanaka, was about to fast forward when a sound crackled through the small speaker. It was a voice. A man's voice, high-pitched, breathless, distorted by the wind and the poor quality of the microcassette. It was frantic, panicked. S-O-S, Tasukete, SOS, help me! The voice was ragged, torn from a throat raw with desperation. Tanaka sat bolt upright, his heart pounding. He rewound the tape and played it again. SOS, Tasukete, Sasa Fukakute, Modorenai. SOS, help me, the bamboo is so deep, I can't go back. Beneath the words, there was another sound, a high, keening wail that sounded less like a human and more like an animal caught in a trap. Or perhaps it was the sound of the wind screaming through a rocky pass. It was impossible to tell. Then came the most chilling part. The voice shouted again, the words clear and sharp despite the distortion. A desperate, last-ditch attempt to orient a rescuer who wasn't there. Koko wa saisho ni ochita tokoro da. This is the spot where I first fell. And then abruptly, the recording cut to a sound that made the hairs on Tanaka's arms stand up. It was a different sound, not words, not the wind. It was a scream. Not a shout for help, but a raw, guttural scream of absolute horror. It went on for 2 seconds, then 3, before being choked off, as if by a hand. It was followed by a burst of unintelligible, frantic shouting, and then nothing, just the hiss of the empty tape. Sergeant Tanaka sat frozen in his chair, the silence of the room now heavy and menacing. He had been a police officer for 20 years. He had heard things no person should ever have to hear. But this was different. This wasn't just a recording of a man in distress. It felt like a recording of a man's last moments on Earth. It felt like a recording of something hunting him. The tape was immediately sent for forensic audio analysis. The experts did what they could, filtering out the wind noise, trying to clarify the voice. They confirmed the words. They confirmed the scream. But they could not identify the voice with certainty. Was it Iwamura? Kudo? The pitch was too high and distorted to be a definitive match for either man. The implications were horrifying. The tape seemed to document the moment one of the hikers became hopelessly lost, trapped in the dense sasa bamboo. The spot where I first fell. He was yelling SOS, the very letters that would later be found constructed from giant logs. But the scream. What was the scream? Was it the final cry of a man succumbing to panic and exhaustion? Or was he screaming at something? The police were now faced with a paradox wrapped in an enigma. They had 3 elements. 1, the bodies. Iwamura and Kudo, dead from exposure, found 2 miles northeast of the sign. The sign, a massive, perfectly constructed onded route to the south. Its construction would have required immense effort, likely from more than one person. The tape, a recording of a desperate man screaming SOS and being trapped in the bamboo, ending in a terrifying scream. How could these 3 pieces possibly fit together? The official investigation stalled, crashing against a wall of impossibility. A number of theories were floated, each more unsettling than the last. Theory 1. Iwamura and Kudo built the sign. This is the most logical, and also the most problematic theory. Perhaps they got lost, realized their peril, and pooled their last strength to build the massive signal. The tape could be a recording of that initial moment of panic. But this theory has major holes. Why would they abandon the sign after completing it? A signal is useless if you aren't there to be found. Why would they then travel 2 more miles through difficult terrain to a secluded hollow to die? It defies all survival logic. Furthermore, could 2 men, already weakened and lost, have accomplished such a feat? Theory 2. The rescued hiker, Shinya Kawamura, built it and lied. This theory suggests that Kawamura, lost and desperate, built the sign himself. When rescued, perhaps out of shame, confusion, or some unknown psychological reason, he denied it. But this seems even less likely. He was physically too weak. There was no motive for him to lie. He was a survivor, not a suspect. And his story of simply stumbling upon the sign remained consistent and credible. Theory 3. The hikers and Kawamura built it together. This is a tantalizing possibility. What if their paths crossed in the wilderness? What if the 3 lost men, united in their desperation, worked together to build the sign? This would explain the scale of the construction, but then what happened? Why did Iwamura and Kudo leave? And why would Kawamura not mention his collaboration with them? It would have been the most important detail of his ordeal. To omit it would be a lie of incredible proportions, for no apparent reason. This is where the story tips over from a simple mystery into the realm of high strangeness. With the logical explanations failing, investigators and amateur sleuths were forced to consider the fringes. Theory 4. A mysterious, unknown fourth party. This is the most chilling and persistent theory. It posits that there was someone else on that mountain, someone who built the giant SOS sign, and then, for reasons unknown, simply walked away. Were they a benevolent ghost, a fellow hiker who built the sign for others, and then managed to save themselves, never coming forward? Or were they something more sinister? This theory connects back to the scream on the tape. What if the scream wasn't from panic, but from an encounter? What if Iwamura and Kudo stumbled upon something they shouldn't have? Something that either built the sign as a lure, or built it for its own reasons, and did not want to be discovered? What if the 2 men fled from the creator of the sign, running for their lives until they collapsed from exhaustion and fear? It sounds like fiction. But on that mountain, with a giant orphan signal and a tape recording of a man's final, terrified screams, the line between fiction and reality had become terrifyingly thin. Part 4. Echoes in the Playground of the Gods. Years have turned into decades. The Daisetsuzan SOS incident has passed from a current news story into a modern legend, a campfire tale for hikers, a case study for paranormal investigators, and a source of unending fascination for those who love an unsolved mystery. The official file remains open, but cold. The questions posed in 1989 are the same questions that hang in the air today, unanswered and likely unanswerable. The story has taken on a life of its own, becoming part of the folklore of the mountain itself. The Ainu people have always known that Kamui Mintara is a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. They speak of spirits of the mountain, of Kamui, that are not always benevolent. Some locals whisper that the sign was not built by human hands at all, that it was a message from the mountain or a warning, a trap. Let's revisit the central, maddening artifact, the sign. Its construction is the key. Experts have stated that felling, stripping, and moving those 19 logs would have been backbreaking work, even with proper tools. For 2 or even 3 exhausted hikers with only a small camp axe, it would have been nearly impossible. The precision of the letters suggests clarity of mind and a surplus of energy, not the frantic, last-gasp effort of men dying from exposure. It feels deliberate, planned. It feels like a statement. And what of the tape? Forensic linguists who have studied the recording have noted the unusually high pitch of the voice. Some have speculated that the speed of the tape was somehow altered, either by a dying battery or by the cold. Others have proposed a more frightening explanation. The pitch is high because it is a voice strained by absolute primal fear. The kind of fear that changes the very sound a human makes. The scream remains the story's dark heart. Was it Kudo screaming as he watched Iwamura collapse, or Iwamura screaming as something emerged from the dense bamboo? The ambiguity is what makes it so terrifying. The human mind abhors a vacuum, and in the space left by that unanswered scream, we project our deepest fears. A wild animal, a crazed hermit living in the mountains, or something else entirely. Something that belongs to the ancient silence of the playground of the gods. Perhaps the most plausible, yet profoundly sad explanation is a chain of tragic coincidences. It's possible Iwamura and Kudo did build the sign using a surge of adrenaline-fueled desperation before their minds, clouded by hypothermia, led them on a final, nonsensical journey away from their only hope. Paradoxical behavior is a known symptom of severe hypothermia. People have been found having removed their clothes in freezing temperatures, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. It's conceivable, then, that they could have performed a monumental act of survival instinct, only to have their delirious minds lead them away from it to their doom. Under this theory, Kawamura's discovery of the sign was a 1-in-a-million stroke of luck, a random intersection of 2 separate tragedies that, when viewed together, create the illusion of a single coherent mystery. But it feels too neat. It doesn't quite account for the sheer scale of the sign or the chilling specificity of the tape. This is the spot where I first fell. It's a landmark, a point of origin for the terror, the scream, the silence. Today, the trails of Daisetsuzan are still walked by thousands of hikers every year. The views are just as stunning, the air just as crisp. But for those who know the story, a shadow lingers. They might look at the dense thickets of Sasa and wonder what secrets they still hold. They might see a stripped birch log and feel a sudden, inexplicable chill. The ghost signal of Mount Asahi is more than just an unsolved case. It is a profound and humbling reminder of our place in the natural world. It tells us that we can chart the land, name the peaks, and carry GPS devices, but we are, and always will be, guests in a realm far older and more powerful than ourselves. The wilderness does not give up its secrets easily. The SOS sign is long gone, reclaimed by the patient, relentless growth of the forest. The logs have rotted into the soil. The clearing is likely overgrown, indistinguishable from any other patch of mountainside. But the signal itself remains. It echoes in the articles written about it, in the hushed conversations of mountaineers, and in the minds of anyone who hears the story. It is a desperate, eternal shout into the void, a question mark carved into the landscape. Who built the sign? What was the source of the scream? We will never know. The only ones who held the true answers were Kenji Iwamura and Koichi Kudo, and they took those answers with them, leaving behind only an impossible monument and a tape recording of their final, terrifying moments in the playground of the gods. Story: The Winter Ghost of Muroran. Part 1: A City of Steel and Silence. To truly understand the story of Asamichita, you must first understand Muroran. Picture it: a city carved into the rugged coastline of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. It is a place of industry, a city whose heart beats to the rhythm of its steel mills and shipyards. Great plumes of white steam billow from smokestacks day and night, mingling with the low-hanging clouds that roll in from the Uchiura Bay. The air, even in summer, carries the metallic tang of labor and the briny, sharp scent of the cold sea. But in December, Muroran transforms. Winter does not simply arrive here, it conquers. A bone-deep cold, born in the Siberian wilderness and carried across the Sea of Japan, descends upon the city. It coats the harbor in a thin, crystalline sheet of ice. It turns the steam from the factories into dense, ghostly fog that suffocates the streets. The sun becomes a pale, indifferent disk in a slate-gray sky, offering little light and even less warmth. Life in Muroran during winter slows, contracts, turns inward. People hurry from their cars to their homes, heads bowed against a wind that feels like it's laced with tiny shards of glass. The city becomes a world of hushed interiors and stark, frozen exteriors. It was in this world, on Thursday, December 6, 2001, that Asamichita, 29 years old, was preparing to go home. Asami was not a native of Muroran. Like many, she had been drawn there by the promise of steady work. She was the manager of a small, cozy cafe called Le Chat Noir, a warm haven of dark wood, soft lighting, and the rich aroma of coffee and baked goods, starkly contrasting with the city's industrial grit. She was good at her job, efficient, kind, with a smile that could momentarily thaw the city's winter chill. Her regulars knew her as a quiet but pleasant presence, a woman who remembered their orders and always had a polite word. In photos, she appears unassuming. A neat bob of dark hair, a gentle face. She was, by all accounts, a typical young woman building a life for herself. She lived alone in a modest apartment in the Saiwaicho district, a simple, clean space that was her sanctuary from the long hours at the cafe. She wasn't known to have a serious boyfriend or any enemies. Her life was a quiet, orderly routine. Work, home, sleep, repeat. A life of comforting predictability. But a subtle, discordant note had recently entered the symphony of her routine. A man. He was a customer, though not a regular one. A few years older than her, unemployed, with a quiet intensity that was more unsettling than charming. He had started frequenting the cafe more often. At first, it was just lingering glances. Then, he began trying to engage her in conversation, asking questions that felt a little too personal. Asami, ever polite, would deflect with professional courtesy. But a seed of unease had been planted. Somehow, he had gotten her personal phone number. The calls began. They were never overtly threatening, but they were persistent, unwanted. He would call her apartment, his voice a low murmur on the other end of the line, filling her small sanctuary with a presence she did not want. She had mentioned it to a few close friends, a note of annoyance and slight fear in her voice. It was a nuisance, a shadow at the edge of her otherwise well-ordered life. She didn't know it yet, but that shadow was lengthening, preparing to swallow her whole. On that December evening, the cold was particularly vicious. The cafe had been slow, the few customers seeking refuge from the wind, leaving early. Asami went through her closing rituals. She wiped down the espresso machine until it gleamed. She stacked the chairs on the polished wooden tables. She counted the day's earnings, her fingers stiff from the chill that seeped through the window panes. At around 10:30 p.m., she locked the front door of Le Chat Noir, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the empty street. Pulling her coat tight around her, she walked the short distance to her car, a small, reliable sedan. The engine turned over, and the heater sputtered to life, blowing lukewarm air onto her cold hands. The drive to her apartment was short, only about 10 minutes. The streets were nearly deserted, cast in the eerie orange glow of the streetlights, softened and blurred by the ever-present fog. It was a drive she had made 1,000 times, a familiar path through the sleeping industrial giant. She was likely thinking of the simple pleasures awaiting her. A warm meal, the mindless comfort of television, the safety of her locked apartment. She was thinking of home. She had no way of knowing she was driving into the heart of a nightmare from which she would never return. Part 2. The Mary Celeste Apartment. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong came not as a scream in the night, but as a silent blinking light. Early the next morning, Friday, December 7th, a patrol officer making his rounds noticed a car parked awkwardly on a quiet side street in the Iriacho district, about a mile from Asami Chita's apartment building. It was her sedan. What struck the officer as odd wasn't just its location, but its condition. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. The headlights, though faint, were still on, their power draining the last dregs from the battery. A pair of pale, tired eyes staring into the gray dawn. The officer approached with caution. Peering inside, the scene grew stranger. The keys were in the ignition. On a passenger seat lay Asami's handbag. He carefully opened it. Her wallet was inside, containing a small amount of cash, about 10,000 yen, and her credit cards. Everything a thief would typically take was still there. The only thing missing was her cell phone. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else. Something incomplete. It felt like a scene paused in the middle of a sentence. The police ran the license plate. Asami Chita. They found her address and the name of her employer. A call to Le Chat Noir confirmed she hadn't shown up for work, an occurrence her colleagues said was completely out of character. Concern began to curdle into alarm. 2 detectives were dispatched to her apartment in Saiwaijo. They arrived at a standard, nondescript apartment building. Climbing the cold concrete stairs to her floor, they found her door. They knocked. "Chita-san? Police." The only answer was the muffled sound of a television from within. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. They tried the doorknob. It was locked. A building manager was summoned with a master key. He inserted it into the top lock and turned. Click. He then moved to the second, lower lock. It was a modern deadbolt, a type that could only be locked from the outside with a key. He inserted the master key. It turned. Click. The door swung open. The 2 detectives stepped inside and into a mystery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The apartment was small, neat, and disturbingly normal. The first thing they noticed was the television, flickering with a morning news program, its cheerful jingle a grotesque counterpoint to the silence in the room. In the small kitchenette area, a scene was set that froze the blood. On a low table sat a dinner for one. A bowl of noodles, a side of vegetables, a pair of chopsticks rested beside the bowl. The meal was half-eaten. It was as if Asami had been in the middle of her dinner, her quiet, solitary ritual after a long day, and had simply vanished. They moved through the small space. Her coat was gone, as were the shoes she would have worn to work. But her indoor slippers were placed neatly by the door, exactly where one would leave them upon entering. Her bed was made. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. Nothing was out of place, except for the most important thing, Asami herself. The scene was a perfect, terrifying paradox. The half-eaten meal and the slippers by the door suggested she had made it home safely. She'd taken off her work shoes, put on her slippers, and started to eat dinner while watching TV. This was her sanctuary. But her car, the vehicle she would have used to get here, was found a mile away, abandoned with her purse and keys inside it. And then there was the lock. The double lock. To lock that second deadbolt from the outside, you needed a key. Asami's keys were in the ignition of her abandoned car. The building manager's master key was accounted for. No one else was known to have a key. So, the question that hung in the air, heavier and more chilling than the winter fog outside, was this. How could the apartment be locked from the outside if the only known key was in a car a mile away? It was a logical impossibility, a riddle straight out of a horror story. It was as if a ghost had spirited her away, pausing only to lock the door behind them with an invisible key. The detectives stood in the silent apartment, the abandoned meal growing cold on the table, and felt a profound sense of unease. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was a violation of the laws of reason. Asami Chida hadn't just disappeared from her apartment. She had been erased from a locked room, leaving behind a puzzle that seemed designed to mock the very notion of a rational explanation. Part 3. The Shadow in the Cafe. The investigation began in earnest, a frantic race against a clock that was already ticking menacingly loud. In Hokkaido's brutal winters, the window for finding a missing person alive shrinks with every passing hour. The police deployed search teams, their bright uniforms stark against the snow-dusted landscape. They combed the area around her apartment and the location where her car was found. Dogs were brought in, but the freezing temperatures and swirling winds made any scent trail impossible to follow. They searched parks, forests, and the bleak, industrial waterfront, their calls of Chida-san swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. Detectives, meanwhile, began to piece together the last hours of her life. They re-interviewed her colleagues at Le Chat Noir. It was here that the shadow began to take form. Hesitantly at first, then with more certainty, her friends and co-workers spoke of the man. He was a 31-year-old unemployed man from a neighboring town. They didn't know his name, but they knew his face. They described his behavior, the way his eyes would follow Asami as she worked, the way he would try to corner her for a conversation when the cafe was quiet. He projected an aura of quiet desperation and simmering obsession that made the staff uncomfortable. And then, a coworker provided the crucial piece of information. Asami had been distressed by phone calls she was receiving at home. She said they were from him. She had no idea how he'd gotten her number, and his persistence was frightening her. The name of the man was quickly identified through his sporadic credit card use at the cafe. Let's call him Nobuo Tanaka. A background check revealed a life lived on the margins. No steady job, living with his parents. No significant criminal record, but a history of social awkwardness and isolation. He was, in essence, a ghost in his own life. The most critical discovery came from Asami's phone records. In the days leading up to her disappearance, there was a flurry of calls from a single unlisted number. When the police traced it, it led directly to the home of Nobuo Tanaka. The detectives felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was their man. They had a motive, obsession, rejection. They had a connection. They just needed to break his alibi. Two senior detectives drove to the Tanaka family home. It was a modest, traditional house, immaculately kept. They were met at the door by Nobuo's elderly parents, their faces etched with confusion and worry. Nobuo was there, sitting in the main room. He was just as the cafe staff had described, thin, quiet, with eyes that seemed to look at something just past their shoulders. He did not seem surprised to see the police. His demeanor was one of unnerving calm. He listened to their questions without expression. "Where were you on the night of Thursday, December 6th? The lead detective asked, his voice level. "I was here," Nobuo said, his own voice a soft monotone. "All evening. I did not leave." His parents immediately and fervently corroborated his story. "He was here," his father insisted. "We had dinner together. We watched television. He never left the house. We would have known." The detectives pressed him. "We have phone records, Tanaka-san. Records showing numerous calls from this house to Ms. Chida's apartment. Can you explain that?" Nobuo's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second. "I may have called her. I liked her. I wanted to talk to her." "Did you talk to her on Thursday night?" "No," he said flatly. I was here. It was a perfect, unshakable alibi, delivered by two credible, earnest-looking parents. Without a body, without a weapon, without a single piece of forensic evidence linking him to Asami, or her car, or her apartment. The alibi was a fortress. The detectives' hands were tied. They knew, with a gut certainty that is the hallmark of experienced investigators, that he was lying. The calm was an act. The parental alibi was either a fabrication born of misguided loyalty or a tragic misunderstanding. But they couldn't prove it. They left the Tanaka house with a profound sense of frustration. They had their monster, but he was protected by a wall of familial devotion. They put him under surveillance, hoping he would make a mistake, lead them to a body, do something. But he did nothing. He stayed at home, rarely venturing out. The ghost had retreated back into his own haunted house. The case stalled. The days turned into a week. The snow fell, blanketing Muroran in a fresh layer of white, bearing any secrets that might have been left on the ground. The hope of finding Asami alive dwindled to a faint, flickering ember. And then, it was extinguished entirely. The investigation had hit a dead end. And then, exactly 1 week after Asami Chita vanished, the case took its final, horrifying turn. Part 4. The final cryptic word. On December 13th, a week to the day after Asami disappeared, a car was found parked by a remote pier at the edge of Muroran's sprawling port. It was Nobuo Tanaka's car. Inside, police found his body. He had committed suicide, running a hose from the exhaust pipe into the car's interior. It was a grim, but not entirely unexpected development. Often, a guilty party, feeling the net tighten, will take their own life. It can be seen as a final, tacit confession. The detectives who arrived on the scene expected this to be the end of the story, the tragic but conclusive final chapter. They were wrong. What they found inside the car didn't offer closure. It only deepened the abyss of uncertainty. In the passenger seat, placed neatly where anyone opening the door would see it, was a note. It was not a confession, it was a denial, but a denial so strangely worded, it felt like something else entirely. It read, "I was chosen as the culprit. My alibi is true. I am tired of this." The words were chilling in their ambiguity. Chosen as the culprit. Not accused, but chosen. As if by some malevolent fate. As if he were a pawn in a game he didn't understand. And the flat insistence, "My alibi is true." Was this the desperate plea of an innocent man hounded to his death? Or the final manipulative lie of a cunning killer, designed to sow confusion and protect his family from the shame of his actions? I am tired of this. The weary sign-off of a man crushed by suspicion, or the exhaustion of a monster who could no longer bear the weight of his secret. The horror, however, did not end with the note. In the trunk of the car, investigators found a bag. Inside the bag was a length of rope, a roll of heavy-duty tape, and plastic sheeting. It was, for all intents and purposes, a kidnapper's toolkit. The discovery was sickening. These were the tools of abduction and murder. Their presence seemed to scream his guilt, to make a mockery of the passive, victim-like tone of his suicide note. The two pieces of evidence were in violent contradiction, the note of an innocent man and the toolkit of a predator. The police were now faced with an even more maddening puzzle. If Nobuo was the killer, why leave a note so vehemently denying it? And if he was innocent, why was he driving around with a bag of items perfectly suited for a kidnapping? The most plausible and most terrifying theory began to form in the minds of the investigators. It was a theory that attempted to reconcile all the impossible elements of the case. The half-eaten meal, the car a mile away, the locked door, the cryptic note, and the killer's toolkit. It went like this. Asami arrives home. She changes into her slippers, begins her dinner. The phone rings. It's Nobuo. Perhaps he says he needs to see her, that it's an emergency. Perhaps he threatens her. Somehow, he lures her out of the apartment. Maybe he was already waiting for her outside. He forces her into her own car. With him at the wheel, he drives the 1.7 kilometers to the quiet side street. There, under the cover of darkness, he incapacitates her, perhaps using the rope and tape from his trunk. He transfers her to his own vehicle. Then comes the most chilling, calculated part of the act. To sow confusion, to create a perfect puzzle, he takes her keys, drives her car back to the vicinity of her apartment, gets out, and walks the short distance to her door. He uses her own key to engage the second deadbolt, locking the room from the outside. Then, he disposes of her key, throwing it into the bay, burying it in the snow, a final, crucial piece of the puzzle erased forever. He then returns to his car, where Asami is now his prisoner, and drives away into the night, to a place from which she will never return. A week later, buckling under the pressure of the investigation, and perhaps the enormity of his crime, he writes his strange, evasive note, parks by the sea, and ends his life, taking the secret of Asami's final resting place with him to the grave. This theory fit the facts, but it painted a portrait of a killer of almost diabolical intelligence and composure, not just a clumsy, obsessive stalker, but a meticulous, cold-blooded predator who in his final moments played one last game with the police. His suicide was not a confession, it was the ultimate act of control. By killing himself, he ensured he would never face a trial, never be forced to reveal what he had done. He slammed the book shut, leaving the final page, the one that tells us where Asami is, forever unwritten. Part 5. The Echo in the Fog. More than 2 decades have passed since that frigid December night. In Muroran, the steel mills still churn, and the winter fog still rolls in off the bay. Life has gone on. The Chat Noir Cafe has long since closed, replaced by another business. The apartment building in Saiwaicho still stands, its rooms occupied by new tenants who likely know nothing of the quiet young woman who once ate her final meal there. But the story of Asami Chida has not faded. It has become part of the city's folklore. A modern ghost story, whispered on cold nights. It is a permanent fixture in the catalog of Japan's most baffling unsolved crimes. A case known as a Kanzen Hanzai, a perfect crime. Asami's family has never had a body to mourn. They are trapped in a state of limbo, a grief with no resolution. For them, every winter is a reminder of the daughter, the sister, who was swallowed by the cold. The case leaves behind a legacy of chilling questions that echo in the silence. What of the alibi? Were Nobuo's parents lying to protect their son, carrying the terrible secret of his guilt to their own graves? Or were they telling the truth? Could he have somehow slipped out of the house unnoticed, committing this complex crime and returning without their knowledge? It seems unlikely. This possibility opens up an even more disturbing thought. What if the parents were right? What if Nobuo Tanaka, the obsessive stalker with the kidnapper's kit in his trunk, was telling the truth in his suicide note? What if he was just a creepy, lonely man who was chosen as the culprit by circumstance, and the pressure of being the prime suspect in a horrific crime drove him to suicide? If that is true, it means that the real killer was never caught. It means a phantom, a monster of immense cunning, committed a perfect murder and framed a convenient suspect, watching from the shadows as the police closed in on the wrong man. It means that the true killer may have walked free, perhaps living a normal life, carrying the knowledge of what he did like a secret treasure. This, in many ways, is a more terrifying conclusion. A monster we can identify is a monster we can comprehend. A monster who remains a complete unknown is a fear without a face. And finally, there is the central, haunting image of the case, the apartment, locked from the outside. A modern-day Mary Celeste on the 3rd floor of a concrete building. It represents the ultimate violation, the invasion of a sanctuary followed by the sealing of that sanctuary, turning a place of safety into a tombstone for a life that had just been there. The story of Asami Chida is not a story about answers. It is a story about their absence. The horror lies not in a bloody spectacle, but in a quiet, empty room. It lies in a car with its headlights slowly dying. It lies in a cryptic note left by a dead man. The true horror is the void. Asami Chida, at 29 years old, walked into the Muroran fog and simply ceased to be. She became a ghost, not of the afterlife, but of the unresolved past, a permanent question mark hanging over a cold industrial city by the sea. And somewhere, perhaps buried deep beneath the Hokkaido snow or resting at the bottom of the dark waters of the bay, the answer lies, silent forever. Story: The Silence of Apartment 401, a true story from Sapporo, Japan. In the winter of 2013, that silence found a home in apartment 401. For Kenji Tanaka, the building manager of the modest Corpo Heights complex in the Shiroishi ward, the silence began as a mild annoyance. The rent for 401 was late, not just a few days, but a full month, then two. Tanaka-san was a man of routine, a creature of habit who believed in the orderly flow of life. Unpaid rent was a disruption, a discordant note in the symphony of his well-managed building. He called the tenant, a woman in her mid-40s. The phone rang and rang, an electronic plea echoing into a void. He left voicemails, his tone shifting from polite reminder to concerned inquiry, and finally, to frustrated demand. He slid notices under her door, the crisp white paper looking stark against the dark wood. They remained uncollected, like fallen leaves no one bothered to sweep away. By late December, with the city buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow, the annoyance had curdled into a genuine, prickling unease. It wasn't just the rent anymore. No one had seen the woman or her two children, a son in his early 20s and a teenage daughter, for months. The neighbors, when asked, would furrow their brows. Them? Oh, they were quiet ones, Mrs. Sato from 301 would say. Kept to themselves, haven't heard a peep in, well, I can't rightly say how long. The final straw was the smell. It was faint at first, a strange cloying sweetness that clung to the fourth-floor hallway. Tanaka-san initially dismissed it as someone's forgotten garbage, but it didn't dissipate. It grew, deepening into something organic and foul, a scent that crawled into the back of your throat and stayed there. It was the smell of decay, ancient and undeniable. On a bitterly cold morning, with the air so sharp it felt like breathing powdered glass, Tanaka-san stood before the door to apartment 401. A police officer on either side of him. He had made the call. The silence had become too loud to ignore. "We have to assume the worst," said the senior officer, a grim-faced veteran named Inspector Ito. His eyes, dark and weary, had seen too many of Sapporo's hidden tragedies. The locksmith, a young man with nervous hands, went to work. The lock was old. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sickeningly loud click that seemed to shatter the hallway's hush. Inspector Ito pushed the door open. The smell hit them like a physical blow. It was a dense, complex miasma of rot and dust and something else, something chemical and sharp. The apartment was dark, the heavy blackout curtains drawn tight against the world. Ito fumbled for the light switch. Nothing. The power had been cut. He clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a bright, dancing circle through the gloom. The beam swept across a small entryway, neat and tidy. Shoes were arranged perfectly by the door. It moved into the main living area, a 6-tatami mat room. And that's when they saw them. The silence of the room was absolute, a sepulchral wait. On a futon, laid out in the center of the floor, were two figures. They were little more than shapes under a thick blanket, skeletal and still. The beam lingered on them, revealing the horror. Their bodies were desiccated, the skin pulled taut over bone, more like ancient mummies than human remains. The dry, frigid air of the unheated apartment had preserved them in a grotesque tableau of death. Inspector Ito felt his stomach clench, a familiar acidic burn. He had been a cop for 30 years, but this was different. This was not the chaotic aftermath of violence. This was the result of a slow, creeping, and utterly quiet extinction. His younger partner, Detective Sato, choked back a gasp, his face pale in the reflected light. "My God, Inspector." "Check the rest of the apartment," Ito commanded, his voice a low growl, more to steady himself than to order his subordinate. Sato, moving with the careful, hesitant steps of a man walking on broken glass, edged past the main room and toward a smaller, closed door. He pushed it open. This room was a child's bedroom, a teenager's by the look of it. A few faded posters of pop bands on the wall, a small desk, a single bed. And on the bed, under a pink comforter, was the third body. The daughter. She was in the same mummified state, a silent sentinel in her own private tomb. The forensic team arrived, their sterile white suits a stark intrusion into the dusty, death-filled space. They worked under the cold, impartial glare of portable floodlights, their movements precise and methodical. The apartment began to give up its secrets, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The refrigerator was spotlessly clean and utterly empty. The gas and electricity had been cut off months ago, a fact confirmed by a calendar on the wall. The last date crossed off was in late January. It was now December. They had been lying here undiscovered for nearly a year. The cupboards held no food, not a grain of rice, not a forgotten packet of ramen, not a single can of preserved fish. Nothing. The family had slowly, methodically, consumed everything they had, and then they had simply stopped. In a city of nearly 2 million people, a family of 3 had vanished from existence, and no one had noticed for 11 months. Inspector Ito stood by the window, peering through a crack in the heavy curtains. Below, the city bustled with holiday shoppers, their colorful coats a stark contrast to the monochrome gray of the apartment. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if apartment 401 existed in another dimension, a pocket of reality where time and life had ceased to function. Who were they? The apartment was scrubbed clean of personal identity. There were no photographs on the walls, no letters, no diaries. It was as if they had deliberately erased themselves before they died. They were a Jane Doe, a John Doe, and another Jane Doe. Ghosts without a past. The true horror of the scene wasn't just the bodies, it was the order, the chilling neatness of it all. This wasn't the messy chaos of a sudden tragedy. This was a managed decline, a controlled descent into oblivion. It spoke of a quiet, desperate pride. It spoke of a refusal to ask for help. Then on the small kitchen table, tucked neatly beside a clean, empty teacup, they found it. A single folded piece of paper. A note. Ito handled it with gloved hands, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He unfolded it. It contained a single, neatly written phrase in elegant calligraphy. Arigato. Arigato. Thank you. The words hung in the frigid air, a statement of such baffling simplicity, it was almost insane. Thank you? Thank you for what? For the life they had? For the death they had found? Was it an expression of gratitude to some forgotten kindness? Or was it the ultimate, most devastatingly polite suicide note in history? The investigation became Ito's obsession. The case gnawed at him, waking him in the dead of night. The image of the 3 mummified figures, the empty refrigerator, and that single polite word, arigato, were burned onto the back of his eyelids. The autopsies provided a clinical, cold narrative that only deepened the mystery. The mother, estimated to be 42, and the son, 23, had died from complications related to starvation and illness. Their stomachs were empty. It was a slow, agonizing death. But the daughter, 19, was different. While malnourished, her cause of death was less clear. There were traces of sleeping pills in her system, not enough for a definitive overdose, but present nonetheless. And forensic analysis of the timeline suggested she had died last. The thought was a sliver of ice in Ito's soul. Had she watched her mother and brother wither away? Had she been the last one left, alone in the silent, freezing apartment with their bodies, before she, too, succumbed? The image was unendurable. A teenage girl, sitting in the dark, the cold seeping into her bones, the silence of the dead, her only companions. What were her final thoughts? Did she light a candle and watch it flicker, its tiny flame a pathetic defiance against the encroaching darkness? Did she write that final cryptic note? The lack of identification was a wall. They were phantoms. Ito ordered his team to dig, to tear apart every piece of paper, every official record. The breakthrough came from the one place they hadn't looked hard enough: Tanaka-san's old rental application files. Tucked away in a dusty cabinet was the original application from 4 years prior. It listed a previous address, not in Hokkaido, but hundreds of miles south, in the Kansai region, near Osaka. It was a thread. Slender and frayed, but a thread nonetheless. Inspector Ito flew to Osaka. The contrast with Sapporo was jarring. The air was warmer, the people louder, the pace of life frantic. He found the old address, a cramped apartment in a sprawling, anonymous suburb. Here, the silence was of a different kind. The silence of people who mind their own business, who don't ask questions. He began knocking on doors, showing the grainy photocopy of the mother's rental application photo. For days, he got nothing but blank stares and shrugged shoulders. They were just another family that had moved away. Finally, an elderly shopkeeper squinted at the photo. Ah, yes, the quiet woman, very proud, always paid in cash. She lost her job, you know. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ito dug into employment records. The woman, whose name they finally learned was Yumi, had worked at a bento box factory. She had been laid off during a corporate downsizing. A single mother with 2 children, her only source of income had vanished overnight. A former coworker, a woman with a kind, sad face, remembered her. Yumi-san was proud, she said, using the same word as the shopkeeper. She never complained. When the layoffs were announced, she just bowed her head and said, "Shikata ga nai, it can't be helped." A few of us offered to help, to lend her some money. She refused. She smiled and said she had a plan, a fresh start, somewhere far away. Somewhere far away, Sapporo, the northern frontier, a place to escape the shame of unemployment, the pitying looks of neighbors, a place to disappear and start over. But the fresh start never came. Yumi found only sporadic, low-paying cleaning jobs in Sapporo. It wasn't enough. Ito pieced together the timeline, the initial savings, the slow, inexorable drain of money, the pride that prevented her from seeking welfare, from reaching out to social services. In Japan, the concept of gaman, of stoic endurance in the face of hardship, is a virtue. For this family, it became a death sentence. Ito imagined the conversations in that cold apartment. The mother, her voice getting weaker, assuring her children that things would get better. The son, who was reportedly disabled and unable to work, growing sicker by the day. And the daughter, watching it all, her teenage world collapsing into a nightmare of hunger and cold. He imagined the day the power was cut, the sudden, plunging darkness, the end of the television's distracting flicker, the hum of the refrigerator, the warmth of the lights. From that day on, there was only the cold and the silence. He imagined the day the food ran out, the last bowl of rice, shared 3 ways, and then, nothing. Days of drinking only water, the gnawing hunger turning into a dull, persistent ache, then into a lethargic acceptance. The greatest horror, Ito realized, was not the death itself, but the slow, conscious walk towards it. They did not die in an accident. They did not die of a sudden illness. They participated in their own quiet annihilation, barricaded behind a wall of pride and shame. And the daughter, she was the heart of the tragedy. Did they make a pact? Did the mother and son pass first? And in her grief and despair, did she decide to join them? Did she tidy the apartment one last time, a final act of filial piety? Did she write thank you, as a farewell to a world that had offered her so little? A thank you to her mother for trying? A thank you for the release from suffering? The question was a bottomless well of sorrow. Back in Sapporo, the case was officially closed. The cause of death was listed as starvation and illness, a tragedy of social isolation, a footnote in the city's vast ledger of human stories. The bodies, now properly identified, were cremated. There were no relatives to claim the ashes. For Inspector Ito, the silence of apartment 401 never truly went away. It became a part of his own internal landscape. He would find himself staring out his office window at the falling snow and see the face of the teenage girl. He would hear the word arigato whispered on the wind. He started to see the potential for a 401 in every apartment building. Behind every drawn curtain, every unanswered door, lay the possibility of a similar, quiet despair. The city, once a familiar and bustling home, now seemed to him a collection of solitary islands, each inhabitant adrift in their own private sea, their signals for help too faint to be heard. One evening, months later, Ito drove past Corpo Heights. A light was on in apartment 401. A new family had moved in. Life, as it always does, had filled the void. New furniture, new routines, new noises. The laughter of a small child echoed faintly from the window.
But Ito knew the truth. The apartment wasn't empty. It was haunted. Not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the echo of a profound silence. It was haunted by the memory of a family who starved to death in the heart of a modern city. Their final word, not a scream for help, not a curse of despair, but a quiet, polite, and eternally horrifying thank you. The snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing the city in a fresh layer of white, burying the secrets and muffling the sounds. But for Inspector Ito and for anyone who knew the story, the silence of apartment 401 would scream forever. Story: The Hakodate Void, A Winter's Killing. Prologue: The Cold. The cold in Hakodate is not a gentle thing. It does not merely chill the skin, it sinks into the marrow of your bones. It's a wet, heavy cold, born from the frigid waters of the Tsugaru Strait that closet the city from three sides. In December, it comes armed with a wind that carries the scent of salt and the promise of snow, a wind that howls through the narrow streets of the Motomachi district and rattles the historic wooden frames of the old consulates. The cold is a living entity in Hakodate, a constant, oppressive presence that dictates the rhythm of life. On the night of December 1st, 2006, the cold was particularly vicious. It had painted the windows of the city with a delicate, crystalline frost and laid a thin, treacherous sheet of black ice on the asphalt. The famous million-dollar view from Mount Hakodate, usually a glittering tapestry of light, was partially obscured by a low-hanging mist, the city's electric heartbeat seeming to pulse weakly against the encroaching darkness. For most, it was a night to be indoors, huddled around a kotatsu, sipping hot ocha or nursing a glass of whiskey. But for the city's taxi drivers, the cold was just a business partner. It was the engine of their trade, driving people from warm homes to warm restaurants, from noisy bars back to quiet apartments. The cold was their constant, silent passenger. And on this night, for one man, the cold was about to welcome in a horror far more profound than any winter storm. A horror that was human, silent, and utterly empty. Part 1. The Last Fare. Mitsuo Koshino was 61 years old, and he knew the streets of Hakodate like the lines on his own weathered hands. He'd been driving a taxi for Koikatsu for over 2 decades, a familiar and comforting presence in his impeccably clean, dark green Toyota Crown Comfort. His colleagues called him Koshino-san, a title of respect for a man who was unfailingly polite, who always had a kind word, and who treated his cab not as a mere vehicle, but as his office, his sanctuary. The dashboard was polished to a gleam, a small, smiling omamori charm from Hakodate Hachiman Shrine swinging gently from the rear-view mirror. It was a charm for traffic safety, a silent prayer for a safe return home each night. That evening, Koshino was feeling the slow, pleasant hum of a life winding down toward a well-deserved rest. Retirement was on the horizon. He and his wife, Etsuko, had plans. They would travel, perhaps see the cherry blossoms in Kyoto without the rush of Golden Week. He would spend more time with his grandchildren, teach them how to fish in the bay and tell them stories of the Hakodate he knew as a boy, a city of steam and salt and the cries of gulls. The night had been steady. A businessman to the airport, a group of laughing students to a karaoke bar, a young couple to the romantic red brick warehouse district. Each fare was a small, fleeting story, a brief intersection of lives. Koshino was a master of the driver's art. He could sense who wanted to talk and who craved silence. He could offer a gentle observation about the weather, or a recommendation for the best ramen, then retreat into a comfortable quiet, letting the city lights and the soft music from the radio fill the space. Around 9:50 p.m., he was cruising near Goryokaku, the massive, star-shaped fort that was one of Hakodate's most famous landmarks. The radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice, but before he could respond, a hand flagged him down. He pulled over smoothly to the curb. The figure standing there was slight,
almost lost in the oversized winter coat. A girl. Her face was partially obscured by a scarf and the shadows of the dim streetlight. She looked young, maybe a high school student. Her hand, when she opened the rear door, was clad in a dark glove. "Good evening," Koshino said, his voice warm and practiced. He turned slightly, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Where can I take you tonight?" The girl slid into the back seat, directly behind him. The door closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing them inside the little world of the Toyota Crown. The warmth of the heater was a stark contrast to the gust of frigid air that had followed her in. "To the Keiba-jo," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and strangely flat, devoid of inflection. The Hakodate racecourse. It was an odd destination for this time of night, especially for a lone teenage girl. The last race had finished hours ago. The place would be deserted, a ghost of its daytime boisterousness. Just a vast, dark expanse of track and empty stands, huddled against the cold by the edge of the sea. A flicker of professional unease, a tiny, almost imperceptible signal, went through Koshino. But he dismissed it. Hakodate was a safe city. This was one of the blessings of living here. Maybe she lived nearby, or was meeting someone. It wasn't his place to question a fare. "The race course, understood?" he said, engaging the meter. The small red numbers began to climb. He pulled away from the curb, the Omamori charm swaying gently. In the rearview mirror, he could see only the top of her head, her hair dark against the pale headrest. She was staring straight ahead, perfectly still. The silence in the cab was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a passenger lost in thought. It was a heavy, deliberate silence. It had weight. It pressed in on him. Koshino cleared his throat, his usual well of small talk suddenly running dry. "Cold night, isn't it?" he tried. A beat passed. Then, a single, clipped word from the back seat. "Yes." He drove on. The city lights grew sparser as they left the central districts behind. They passed silent convenience stores, their fluorescent glow looking lonely in the dark. They drove past rows of houses, their windows either dark with sleep or warm with the golden light of family life. For the first time in a long while, Koshino felt a pang of longing to be home, to be in his own warm house with Etsuko. The girl gave him a series of quiet, precise directions. "Turn here. Go straight. Left at the next light." Each command was delivered in that same unnerving monotone. It was as if she had the route memorized, a path leading to a specific, predetermined point. They were now on a poorly lit service road that ran alongside the vast, dark perimeter of the racecourse. The high fences and skeletal trees cast long, distorted shadows across the road. There were no other cars, no pedestrians. There was only the sound of his engine, the crunch of the tires on the icy asphalt, and the heavy, breathing silence from the back seat. The hair on the back of Koshino's neck began to prickle. This was wrong. The feeling was no longer a flicker. It was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He'd been a soldier as a young man, stationed in colder, more dangerous places than this. He knew the feeling of being watched, the sixth sense that warned of unseen threats. He was feeling it now, in his own cab, in his own city. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. Her face was still in shadow, but he could see her eyes. They were dark, wide, and fixed on the back of his head. There was nothing in them, no anger, no fear, no excitement, nothing. It was like looking into two black holes, 2 points of absolute emptiness. It was the void. "Here," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Stop here." They were in the darkest part of the road, a desolate spot with a line of trees on one side, and the racecourse fence on the other. A streetlight 100 yards away was broken, casting the area in near total blackness. Koshino pulled the car to a stop and turned on the interior light. The sudden brightness was harsh. He put the car in park and turned to face his passenger, forcing a professional calm he did not feel. "That will be 140 yen, please," he said. The girl did not move. She did not reach for a purse or a wallet. She just sat there, her gloved hands resting in her lap. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. It was an eternity. The ticking of the cooling engine was deafening. "Miss," Koshino prompted, his voice a little tight. And then, she moved. It was not a move for money. Her right hand, which had been hidden from his view, came up from her lap. It was moving with a fluid, practiced speed that was terrifyingly out of place. In it, she held something that glinted dully in the dome light. A knife. A kitchen knife, long and slender, its edge wickedly sharp. Koshino's mind fractured. Decades of peaceful routine, of polite greetings and safe journeys, shattered in a single horrific instant. There was no time to scream, no time to react, no time to understand. The charm from the Hachiman shrine swayed, a useless sentinel. The girl lunged forward from the back seat, her slight frame generating an impossible amount of force. Her left arm snaked around his neck, pulling his head back against the seat, exposing his throat. Her right hand, holding the knife, drew back. He saw her eyes one last time. They were inches from his, and they still held that same terrifying, impossible emptiness. There was no rage, no madness. There was only a cold, detached curiosity. It was the look of a scientist observing an experiment. The first thrust was to the neck. A searing, white-hot pain exploded through him. It was a shock so profound it felt unreal, a disconnect between body and mind. He heard a wet, tearing sound, and then a gurgle that he dimly recognized as his own. His hands flew up, clumsy and weak, trying to push her away, to grab the weapon. But she was relentless. She was a machine. Stab, stab, stab. Again and again, the neck, the chest, the shoulder. The blows were not frenzied or panicked. They were deliberate, methodical, each one aimed, each one purposeful. The warm, metallic smell of blood filled the small space of the cab, thick and suffocating. His vision began to swim, the bright interior light blurring into a halo. The face of his wife, Etsuko, flashed in his mind. The laughter of his grandchildren, the quiet peace of his retirement, now a phantom that was dissolving into red. His struggles grew weaker. His hands fell to his sides. The world narrowed to the sound of his own dying breath, and the sight of those empty, empty eyes. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The pressure on his neck released. He slumped forward against the steering wheel, the car horn blaring a single long, mournful cry into the desolate night. The back door opened, letting in a blast of Arctic air. The girl stepped out of the cab, her movements calm and unhurried. She closed the door gently, as any polite passenger would. She looked at her work through the window for a moment, her breath misting in the cold. Her face, finally visible in the spill of the interior light, was placid, unmoved. She adjusted her scarf, pulled her coat tight around her, and walked away, her footsteps making soft, crunching sounds on the icy ground. She disappeared into the oppressive darkness, leaving behind the green Toyota Crown, its engine still ticking, its horn still screaming, and the body of Mitsuo Koshino, a good man whose final journey had ended in a place of incomprehensible emptiness. The cold of Hakodate had found its way inside. Part 2. The Crimson Snow Detective. Kenji Tanaka of the Hakodate Prefectural Police was a man who, like Mitsuo Koshino, was deeply woven into the fabric of the city. He was 45, a veteran of the force, with a face carved by years of stress and too little sleep, and eyes that had seen the spectrum of human frailty. He'd handled everything from petty theft to domestic disputes that ended in tragedy. But Hakodate was, by and large, a peaceful place. Homicide was a rare and shocking event, an aberration that tore at the city's quiet sense of security. The call came in at 10:15 p.m. A resident living near the racecourse had reported a car horn blaring continuously for several minutes. A patrol car was dispatched to investigate a possible accident or breakdown. What the two young officers found was a scene from a nightmare. When Tanaka arrived, the area was already cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered violently in the wind. The green Toyota Crown stood under the harsh, sterile lights of the police floodlights, a grim diorama of violence. The horn had been silenced. The driver's side door was ajar, where the first responders had checked for a pulse they knew they wouldn't find. Tanaka took a deep breath of the freezing air, the menthol from his cigarette doing little to calm the familiar churn in his gut. He ducked under the tape, his shoes crunching on the frosted ground. "What have we got, Saito?" he asked his younger partner. Saito, pale-faced, pointed toward the cab. "Victim is a male. Looks to be in his 60s. Driver for Kawai Kotsu. Multiple stab wounds. It's a bad one, Kenji-san. A real mess." Tanaka approached the car, his gaze clinical, detached. It was a defense mechanism honed over years. He saw the victim, Mitsuo Koshino, though he didn't know his name yet. He was slumped, the seatbelt still across his chest, a testament to his ingrained sense of safety. The interior of the cab was a slaughterhouse. Blood was everywhere. On the dashboard, the steering wheel, the windows, the ceiling. It had soaked through Koshino's uniform and pooled on the floor mat. The contrast between the meticulous cleanliness of the vehicle and the explosive violence that had occurred within it was sickening. The forensics team was already at work, their movements precise and quiet. They dusted for prints, collected fibers, and photographed every angle. One detail immediately struck Tanaka as odd. The blood spatter pattern was concentrated in the front, but the attack seemed to have come from behind. There were no signs of a struggle outside the vehicle. The rear passenger door was closed neatly. Nothing was stolen. Koshino's wallet was still in his pocket, cash inside. The taxi's earnings pouch was untouched on the passenger seat.
This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something else. This was personal, or it was purely psychotic. Tanaka's eyes scanned the area around the cab. The ground was hard and icy, but there was a light dusting of snow near the edge of the road. And in that snow, they found them. A single set of footprints, small and shallow, leading away from the taxi and vanishing into the darkness toward a residential area. The stride was even, unhurried, not the footprints of someone fleeing in a panic, the footprints of someone taking a walk. The killer was a passenger, Tanaka said, his voice low. He or she sat in the back, directed him here, and then this. The investigation began with a grim and painstaking process of identification. By midnight, they had a name: Mitsuo Koshino. Tanaka had the heartbreaking duty of overseeing the notification of his wife. He heard her scream of disbelief and anguish over the phone, a sound that would echo in his thoughts for weeks. A good man, a husband, a grandfather, was dead for no apparent reason. The focus shifted to the last fare. Kawai Kotsu's dispatch records were clean. Koshino hadn't picked up a dispatched fare. He'd been flagged down, a ghost, a random encounter. This was the investigators' worst-case scenario. The next 48 hours were a frantic blur. Tanaka and his team worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and a gnawing sense of urgency. The media had caught wind of the story, and the Hakode taxi slaying was on every news channel. Fear, cold and sharp as the murder weapon, began to spread through the city. Taxi drivers started looking at every passenger with suspicion. People who normally hailed cabs late at night chose to walk or wait for the last bus. The city's trust had been punctured. They canvassed the area around Goryokaku, where Koshino had likely picked up his killer. They interviewed hundreds of people, shopkeepers, pedestrians, anyone who might have been out between 9:30 and 10 p.m. They got nothing. No one remembered seeing a lone person flagging down a cab. In the winter, everyone is bundled up, faces hidden. Just another anonymous figure against the cold. The forensics report came back with few leads. There were no usable fingerprints in the back of the cab, suggesting the killer wore gloves. The footprints gave them a rough shoe size, but nothing more specific. The murder weapon was missing. The only real clue was the nature of the act itself. The medical examiner's report was brutal. Koshino had been stabbed over a dozen times. The wounds were deep, precise. The fatal wound was a clean slice across the carotid artery. But there were other, more hesitant cuts, what the ME called hesitation marks. Except they weren't on the victim. They were wounds that suggested the killer was experimenting, learning. It was a chilling thought. Tanaka felt like he was hunting a phantom. This killer had appeared out of the night, committed an act of extreme violence with surgical coldness, and then vanished back into the city's anonymous sprawl. There was no motive, no robbery, no sexual assault, no obvious grudge. It was just a killing, an act of pure nihilistic violence. It was a void. On the third day,
A small break came from an unexpected place. A high school girl had confessed to her friend that she was feeling anxious about the news. The friend, alarmed by her strange behavior, told her parents, who, after a sleepless night, made a call to the police hotline. It was a flimsy lead, one of hundreds, but the girl mentioned lived in the area where the footprints had disappeared. It was enough. Tanaka and Saito drove to a modest, two-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was the kind of house you'd find anywhere in Japan, neat and unassuming. They were met at the door by a bewildered-looking mother. "We'd like to speak with your daughter," Tanaka said, his voice gentle. A moment later, the girl appeared. She was 17, with long dark hair and a pale, unremarkable face. She was wearing her school uniform. She looked at the two detectives standing in her doorway with an expression that Tanaka could not read. It wasn't fear. It wasn't surprise. It was a kind of placid curiosity. He saw the same look he had imagined in the back of that taxi, the same emptiness.
"Can you come with us to the station?" Tanaka asked.
"We have some questions for you." The girl nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice the same flat, quiet monotone he would soon come to know so well. As she went to get her coat, her mother began to weep, a quiet, confused sound. She had no idea that the monster the entire city was afraid of had been sleeping under her roof. Part 3. The Confession in Room 4. The interrogation room at Hakodate Central was a small, soul-crushing box. Gray walls, a gray metal table, 3 gray chairs. The only color came from the green tea the uniformed officer placed before them. Detective Tanaka sat opposite the girl. Her name, he now knew, was a common, pretty name, one that evoked images of winter purity. It felt like a sick joke. For the first hour, she said nothing. She sat perfectly straight, her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over Tanaka's shoulder. She answered his gentle, probing questions with silence or single-word replies. "Were you near the race course on Friday night?" "No." "Do you know Mitsuo Koshino?" "No." "Where were you at 10 p.m. on Friday?" "Home." Tanaka was patient. He'd broken hardened Yakuza members, men who lived by a code of silence. But this was different. This wasn't a code. This was a wall. He sensed that behind that wall, there wasn't a secret, but a chasm. He decided to change tactics. He stopped asking questions and simply sat in silence with her. He let the quiet of the room grow, let it become as heavy and oppressive as the silence in Koshino's cab. 5 minutes, 10, 20. He just watched her. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. Her composure was absolute, and it was the most unnerving thing he had ever witnessed. But finally, his voice barely a whisper. "We found the knife." It was a bluff. They hadn't. For the first time, her eyes flickered. They moved from the wall and met his, and for the first time, she spoke in a full sentence. "Where did you find it?" she asked. The question was not one of panic, but of genuine academic curiosity. As if he'd solved a puzzle she'd set. The dam had broken. "Why don't you tell me where you put it?" Tanaka countered, keeping his voice level. She looked down at her hands on the table. She seemed to be considering the question, not as an accusation, but as a request for information. "I took it from the kitchen at home," she began, her voice still a monotone, a narrator recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "I had it in my school bag for a week. I was waiting for the right time." Tanaka felt a cold dread snake up his spine. This was premeditated. "On Friday, I left the house after dinner. I told my mother I was going to the library. I walked to Goryokaku. I waited for a taxi that had an older driver, someone who wouldn't fight back too much." She recounted the events with a chilling, step-by-step clarity, hailing the cab, giving the directions, the silence. She described the location she chose as ideal due to the lack of light and witnesses. She spoke of it like a student presenting a project. And then what happened? Tanaka prompted, his own voice sounding strained in his ears. She looked up at him again, her eyes holding that same black hole emptiness. I killed him. She said the words as if she were saying, I bought a soda. Saito, sitting in the corner, let out an involuntary gasp. Tanaka shot him a look to stay quiet. Why? Tanaka asked. It was the only question that mattered. The question the whole city was asking. The question Mitsuo Koshino's family would ask for the rest of their lives. Did he say something to you? Did you want his money? She shook her head slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. It was the most horrifying expression Tanaka had ever seen. No, she said. He was very polite. Then why? Tanaka pressed, his voice rising despite himself. Why did you kill him? She paused, and in that pause, Tanaka felt the full weight of the void that he had been sensing all along. He was staring into the abyss, and the abyss was a 17-year-old girl in a school uniform. Her answer, when it came, would haunt him for the rest of his life. I just wanted to know what it was like, she said. To kill someone. I've seen it in movies and read about it in books. I was curious about how it would feel. I wanted to see if I could do it. Tanaka stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. There was no motive, no passion, no greed, no revenge, no madness. There was only curiosity, a lethal, sociopathic curiosity. She had murdered a man, destroyed a family, and terrified a city to satisfy a whim. She had treated a human life as an experiment.
And how did it feel? He asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She considered this for a moment, her head tilted slightly. It was less dramatic than I expected, she said. There was a lot of blood. It was messy, but I didn't feel anything. Not sad, not happy. Just nothing. Nothing. The void. She then calmly told them where she had disposed of the evidence. She had walked home, cleaned herself up meticulously, and hidden the bloody knife and gloves inside a hollowed-out book in her bedroom. She had gone to bed and slept soundly. The next day, she had gone to school as if nothing had happened. The confession was complete. It was a perfect, seamless narrative of horror delivered without a single flicker of remorse, empathy, or humanity. She was a black hole in human form, consuming light and life and giving back only emptiness. Detective Tanaka had spent his career dealing with the darkness in the human heart. But this was something new. This was the absence of a heart altogether. He felt sick. He felt old. And for the first time in his career, he felt truly, deeply afraid. Part 4. The Echo in the Cold. The discovery that the killer was a local high school girl with no criminal record and a good family sent a shockwave through Hakodate, more powerful than any earthquake. The initial fear of a shadowy, monstrous predator was replaced by a far more insidious horror. The monster was one of them. She was a daughter, a student, a neighbor. The evil wasn't an invader. It had been born and raised in their own quiet, snowy streets. The media descended, camping outside the girl's house and her school. They dubbed her the Hakodate High School Killer, dissecting every aspect of her life, searching for a reason, a clue, a sign that could explain the inexplicable. They found nothing. She was an average student. She had a few friends. She was quiet, but not an outcast. She was, by all accounts, completely and terrifyingly normal. And that was the true terror of the Hakodate void. It suggested that the barrier between normalcy and monstrousness was not a wall, but a thin, fragile membrane that could be punctured by something as simple and as awful as curiosity. For the family of Mitsuo Koshino, the revelation brought no peace. Their grief was now compounded by a suffocating, unanswerable why. How could they mourn a death that had no meaning? It wasn't a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was an absurdity. A good man's life had been extinguished as a casual experiment. His wife, Etsuko, retreated into a shell of silent sorrow. His grandchildren were now afraid of the dark, of strangers, of the city they had always loved.
The omamori charm for traffic safety was returned to his family, a cruel and bitter relic of a prayer that had gone unanswered. Because of her age, the girl was tried as a juvenile. The proceedings were closed to the public, her name legally protected, her future shielded by a system designed for rehabilitation, not for understanding pure nihilism. She was sent to a juvenile reformatory, her sentence a finite number of years, for an act of infinite finality. She would one day be released, her name changed, free to walk back into the society whose fundamental rules she had so casually violated. Detective Kenji Tanaka retired a few years later. The case had broken something in him. He had always believed that, at the core of every crime, there was a human reason, however twisted. Greed, jealousy, anger, fear, these were things he could understand. But the girl had shown him something else. She had shown him the void, the horrifying possibility of action without motive, of effect without cause. Sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would drive out to the desolate road by the Hakodate racecourse. He would park his car where Koshino's taxi had been, turn off the engine, and sit in the profound, heavy silence. He would stare out at the skeletal trees and the high fence, and he would think of Mitsuo Koshino, a decent man just trying to get home. And he would think of the girl. He wondered if she ever felt anything. If, in the quiet of her cell, she ever saw Koshino's face, or if, as he suspected, she simply saw nothing at all. The cold in Hakodate is a living thing. It seeps into the cracks of the city and the hearts of its people. But since that December in 2006, there has been a new kind of cold in the city. It's the chill of knowing that the greatest horror is not the monster that lurks in the shadows, but the emptiness that can sit right behind you, polite and silent, on the last ride home. It is the echo of a question that can never be answered, a void that can never be filled.
Story: The Winter Ghost of Chitose. The cold in Hokkaido is not like other colds. It's a primal force, a living entity that seeps through the thickest wool, settles deep in the bones, and holds the world in a crystalline grip. In November of 1975, that cold had already laid its claim on the city of Chitose, a quiet, orderly town known more for its bustling airport and proximity to pristine national parks than for the darkness that lurks in the human heart. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the sounds of the city, blanketing the slate-gray rooftops and bare-branched birch trees in a deceptive purity. It was a city that felt safe, insulated from the chaos of the wider world by geography, and a shared sense of community. This illusion of safety, like a thin sheet of ice over deep black water, was about to be shattered. Our story begins, as so many tragedies do, on a perfectly ordinary day. Her name was Yumi Tanaka, though that is not the name her family knows her by. We use it here to give a voice to her terror, to honor the girl who walked into the heart of a nightmare. She was 17, a junior at Chitose High School, with a laugh that could make the sternest teachers crack a smile, and a future that stretched before her, bright and limitless, as the Hokkaido sky on a rare, clear summer day. On that Tuesday, the final bell had rung, its shrill cry echoing through the hallways, signaling the end of another day of lectures on classical Japanese literature and the unforgiving complexities of calculus. Yumi gathered her books, her movements fluid and unhurried. She chatted with her friends, their conversation a light, bubbling stream of gossip, plans for the weekend, and complaints about homework. They walked together for a few blocks, a tight-knit cluster of navy blue uniforms against the stark white of the snow-lined streets, their breath pluming in the frigid air. One by one, her friends peeled off, turning down their respective streets, with waves and shouted goodbyes, until Yumi was alone. Her path home was a familiar one, a route she had walked 1,000 times before. It took her past the small, family-run ramen shop that always smelled of rich pork broth and toasted sesame, past the quiet Shinto shrine where she sometimes stopped to offer a quick prayer, and along a narrow lane bordered by modest, two-story homes. The sun was already bleeding towards the horizon, painting the snow-heavy clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange. Streetlights began to flicker on,
casting long, skeletal shadows that danced and writhed with every gust of wind. The world was growing quiet. The silence, usually a comfort, began to feel watchful. Yumi pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. It was a feeling more than a sound, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the prickling sensation on the back of her neck that signaled she was no longer alone. She quickened her pace, her sensible school shoes crunching a frantic rhythm on the compacted snow. She chanced a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street, the darkening sky, and the silent snow-draped houses. She told herself it was her imagination, the creeping paranoia of a girl walking alone as twilight fell. She was wrong. From the deep shadow of an alleyway between two houses, a figure emerged. It happened so fast it was less a sequence of events and more a single, violent impact on her senses. There was the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something metallic and sour. A hand, rough and calloused, clamped over her mouth, stifling the scream before it could even form in her throat. An arm, strong as an iron band, wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. Her books scattered, falling to the snow with a soft, muffled thud, the only sound in the sudden, terrifying silence. Her world tilted, a maelstrom of white snow, gray sky, and the dark wool of a man's overcoat pressed against her face. She kicked and thrashed, her legs flailing uselessly. The hand over her mouth tightened, a thumb pressing cruelly into the soft flesh of her cheek. A low voice, a guttural whisper right next to her ear said a single chilling word. Quiet. She was bundled into the back of a car, the door slamming shut with a sound of absolute finality, like a coffin lid being sealed. A blindfold, smelling of dust and motor oil, was yanked over her eyes, plunging her into a world of pure, suffocating blackness. Her hands were bound behind her back with a coarse rope that bit into her wrists. The car lurched into motion, its tires spinning for a moment on the slick street before finding purchase and pulling away, leaving behind only a set of rapidly fading tracks and a few forgotten schoolbooks lying in the snow, their pages open to a lesson she would never finish. At the Tanaka home, the clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Mrs. Tanaka hummed to herself as she moved about the kitchen, the familiar, comforting smells of miso soup and grilled fish filling the small house. The table was set for 3. Mr. Tanaka sat in his usual armchair, reading the evening paper, a placid ritual that had anchored his days for 30 years.
6 o'clock came and went. Yumi was never late. She's probably with her friends at the library, Mrs. Tanaka said, more to herself than to her husband. But her humming had stopped. By 6:30, a thread of unease had begun to weave itself into the fabric of their quiet evening. Mr. Tanaka put down his paper. I'll call the Nakamuras. Maybe she went there. She hadn't. Nor had she gone to the Satos or the Ishikawas. A series of phone calls, each one more frantic than the last, confirmed the same thing. No one had seen Yumi since she had parted ways with her friends just a few blocks from home. By 7:30, the unease had blossomed into a cold, hard knot of fear in their stomachs. The untouched dinner grew cold on the table. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with unspoken terrors. Mr. Tanaka, a man of profound composure, found his hands were trembling as he picked up the receiver one last time. He did not call another friend. He called the Chitose Police Department. The initial report was handled with the polite procedural efficiency typical of a small-town police force. An officer was dispatched. He asked questions. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Is there any chance she ran away? The questions were standard, but for the Tanakas, they felt like accusations, each one a small cruelty that scraped at their raw, terrified nerves. The search began that night. Flashlight beams cut through the falling snow as officers retraced Yumi's route. They found her books, lying scattered like fallen birds, their pages already stiff with ice. It was the first concrete sign that this was not a teenage girl running off for a night of harmless rebellion. This was something else, something far worse. The case landed on the desk of Detective Kenji Sato of the Hokkaido Prefectural Police. Sato was a veteran, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains that ringed the island. He had seen a share of darkness, but kidnappings were rare, especially here. They were a crime of the big cities, of Tokyo, of Osaka, not of quiet Chitose. He established a command post at the local precinct, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of men speaking into telephones. Maps were pinned to the walls, Yumi's route marked in a stark red line. The first 24 hours were a blur of frustrating dead ends. Interviews with friends and teachers yielded nothing.
A canvas of the neighborhood where she disappeared turned up no witnesses. It was as if a ghost had reached out of the winter twilight and simply spirited her away. The Tanakas waited by the phone, which had transformed from a simple household appliance into a totem of both hope and dread. Every time it was silent, the despair deepened. Every time it rang, a jolt of pure adrenaline and terror shot through them. It was always a well-meaning relative or a friend, their voices laced with a pity that felt almost unbearable. For 2 days, there was nothing. 2 days of agonizing silence. In the public eye, Yumi Tanaka was a smiling school photograph on the evening news, a name in the headlines. For her parents, she was an empty chair at the dinner table, a cold and silent bedroom, a ghost haunting the hallways of her own home. For Detective Sato, she was a growing weight on his conscience, a puzzle with no pieces. And for Yumi, those 2 days were an eternity spent in hell. She was in a small, square room. Even with the blindfold on, she knew it was small from the way sound echoed, from the closeness of the air, which was stale and thick with the smell of unwashed laundry and instant noodles. She was on a futon on the floor, her hands still bound. The rope had chafed her wrists raw. Her captor was a phantom. She rarely heard him speak. He moved with a quiet deliberation that was somehow more terrifying than rage. She would hear the soft shuffle of his feet on the tatami mats, the click of a lighter, the faint hiss of a gas stove. He would bring her food, a rice ball, a cup of lukewarm tea, and place it near her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting, repulsive moment. He never spoke a word. He would simply place the food down and retreat, leaving her alone in the darkness with the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Time ceased to have meaning. There was no day, no night. There was only the darkness, the silence, and the fear. The fear was a constant companion, a cold, oily presence that coated her skin and filled her lungs. She would drift in and out of a restless, nightmare-plagued sleep, only to wake up to the same terrifying reality. She tried to listen, to gather clues. The building was quiet. Occasionally, she would hear the distant, mournful wail of a train whistle. That was it. She was a prisoner in a box, a ghost in a stranger's life.
Who was he? Why had he taken her? Was it for money, for some other unspeakable reason? The not knowing was a unique form of torture. Her imagination, starved of sensory input, ran wild, conjuring images of a leering monster. But the reality of his quiet, almost mundane presence was worse. He wasn't a monster from a fairy tale. He was a man, and that made the horror so much more real, so much more intimate. On the third day, the silence was broken. The phone in the Tanaka's house rang, but this time, it was different. Mr. Tanaka snatched the receiver, his voice a choked whisper. "Hello?" There was a pause, a breath of static, and then a voice. It was flat, metallic, and devoid of any emotion. It was a voice that didn't seem to belong to a human being. "I have your daughter." The world stopped. The air in the room solidified. Mrs. Tanaka let out a small, strangled cry. Detective Sato, who had been listening on an extension in the next room with a team of technicians, motioned frantically. "Keep him talking. Is she all right?" Mr. Tanaka managed, his voice cracking. "She is fine. For now," the voice said. "You will listen carefully. 5 million yen, small unmarked bills. You will wait for instructions on the delivery. If you have contacted the police, you will never see her again." The line went dead. The click was as loud as a gunshot. The demand was made. The game had begun. The police command center erupted into a hive of controlled chaos. The call had been too short to trace. In 1975, tracing a phone call wasn't a matter of clicking a mouse. It was a complex physical process involving technicians at the telephone exchange manually connecting circuits, a race against the clock that they had just lost. Sato slammed his fist on the table, a rare display of frustration. He was on for less than 30 seconds. He knows what he's doing. The kidnapper was smart, careful. This was not an amateur. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the phone. The Tanaka's line was now the epicenter of the entire operation. Technicians installed a state-of-the-art reel-to-reel tape recorder, a bulky machine of spinning wheels and magnetic tape that would capture every sound, every breath. Teams were put on standby at the central telephone exchange, ready to spring into action the second the next call came. The waiting was excruciating.
For the police, it was a high-stakes strategic pause. For the Tanakas, it was a living torture. They sat by the phone, prisoners in their own home, every fiber of their being attuned to the possibility of its ring. The second call came the next day. The same cold, robotic voice. "Do you have the money?" "Yes, yes," Mr. Tanaka stammered, reading from a script prepared by Sato. "But I need to know Yumi is safe. Let me speak to her." There was a long pause. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought he would hang up. The technicians at the exchange were already working, their hands flying across the switchboards, trying to follow the electronic breadcrumbs of the call. Then, a faint, rustling sound, and a voice, Yumi's voice. It was small, thin, and trembling, but it was hers. "Papa. Yumi. Yumi, are you okay?" I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then, the sound of the phone being snatched away. The cold voice was back. "You have your proof. The next call will have the instructions. Be ready." Click. He was gone again. The trace had failed. He was too fast. But they had something invaluable. Yumi's voice. The recording was analyzed by experts. They noted the acoustics in the background, the faint, almost imperceptible echo. "She's in a small room," one technician said. "Probably tatami mats. They absorb sound, not much furniture."
And they heard something else. Buried deep in the background noise, right before the line went dead, was a sound. A faint, rhythmic clatter. Click-clack. Click-clack. It was the sound of a train passing over tracks. It was a tiny clue, but it was the first real one they had. Sato stared at the map of Chitose. The city was crisscrossed with railway lines. The main JR line ran right through the center of town. It narrowed the search, but only slightly. There were thousands of apartments, thousands of houses, within earshot of the tracks. The kidnapper was toying with them, enjoying his power. He was a ghost, a voice on the wire, holding a family, a city, and the entire police force hostage. The media frenzy was at a fever pitch. The Chitose Phantom was on the front page of every newspaper in Japan. The pressure on Sato and his team was immense. Sato knew they had to change the game. They couldn't win by being reactive. They needed to force the kidnapper's hand, to make him stay on the line long enough for the trace to succeed. He devised a desperate, risky plan. The next time he called, Mr. Tanaka would feign confusion and distress. He would ask him to repeat the instructions, claim he couldn't hear properly, anything to buy them precious seconds. Each second was a lifetime for the technicians at the exchange. The third call came 2 days later. "The drop will be tonight," the voice said, and began to detail a complex set of instructions involving a locker at the main train station. Mr. Tanaka took a deep, shuddering breath and began his performance. Wait, I can't hear you. "The connection is bad. What locker? Please, you have to speak up." "Are you deaf?" the voice snapped, a flicker of irritation momentarily breaking through the cold facade. "Please, I'm an old man. I'm terrified. Just tell me again, slowly," Mr. Tanaka pleaded, his voice a convincing symphony of pathetic desperation. Sato, listening in, held his breath. At the telephone exchange, it was a scene of frantic, silent ballet. Technicians shouted coordinates to each other, plugging and unplugging thick cables, their faces illuminated by the green glow of oscilloscope screens. They were tracing the call back from the Tanaka home, through a local substation to a main trunk line, and then trying to pinpoint the specific exchange it originated from. "He's still on," someone hissed into a headset connected to the command post. 30 seconds. "What did you say?" Mr. Tanaka continued, his voice rising in manufactured panic. "My wife has collapsed. I need to... Please, just tell me one more time." "You're a fool," the voice snarled. "The locker at 45 seconds. We're close. We have the exchange. It's the one near the main station. Tracing the local loop now. Come on, come on." The seconds stretched into an eternity. Sato could feel the sweat trickling down his back. The entire investigation, Yumi's life, it all hinged on these next few moments. "We've got it!" a voice screamed from the exchange. "We have the building. It's the Green Heights apartment complex, Block B, just south of the station." At that exact moment,
The kidnapper seemed to sense the trap closing. "You are trying to trick me," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You will regret this." Click. But it was too late. They had him. Detective Sato didn't hesitate. "Go, go, go!" he roared. Teams of uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives, who had been on standby in unmarked cars, converged on the Green Heights apartment complex. It was a drab, concrete building, typical of the era, filled with small apartments for single workers and young couples. Anonymous. Perfect for a ghost to hide in. They sealed the building, quietly and efficiently. No sirens, no flashing lights. They had the building, but they didn't have the apartment number. A direct trace to a specific unit was beyond the technology of the day. They would have to do this the hard way, door by door. Sato led the canvassing team himself. It was delicate work. They couldn't just kick down doors. They had to be subtle, to find their man without tipping him off and forcing him to do something desperate. They posed as city workers checking on gas lines, as salesmen, as census takers. They worked their way up from the first floor. Door after door opened to reveal ordinary lives. A young mother with a crying baby, an elderly man watching television, a group of students playing mahjong. With each normal encounter, the tension grew. He was here, somewhere, breathing the same air. They reached the fourth floor. Sato knocked on the door of apartment 402. The door opened a few inches, held by a security chain. A man's face appeared in the gap. He was in his late 20s with thinning hair, glasses, and a thoroughly unremarkable face. He looked like 1,000 other office workers. He looked normal. "Yes?" the man asked, his voice quiet. Sato's blood ran cold. He recognized the cadence. He recognized the flat, emotionless tone. Even without the metallic distortion of the telephone, he knew. This was the voice. "Good evening, sir," Sato said, his own voice steady. "Chitose police were investigating a disturbance reported in the area. Have you heard anything unusual in the last few days?" The man's eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, flickered for just a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible sign of a lie being formed. "No, officer," the man said calmly. "It's been very quiet here." His name, according to the slip on his door, was Fumio Onuki. Quiet. The word hung in the air. Behind Onuki, through the crack in the door, Sato saw something. A girl's red scarf, lying on the floor just inside the entryway. The same scarf that Mrs. Tanaka had described Yumi as wearing. A scarf she had knitted for her herself. It was all the confirmation Sato needed. He gave a subtle, prearranged hand signal to the tactical officers waiting in the stairwell. "Mr. Onuki," Sato said, his voice now hard as steel. "We have reason to believe you are holding someone against their will. Open this door now." Onuki's face contorted, the mask of normalcy melting away to reveal the panicked, cornered animal beneath. He slammed the door shut, the sound of the chain being fumbled with, then the deadbolt sliding home. "Breach!" Sato yelled. The tactical team moved with explosive force. A heavy ram struck the door, once, twice. The wood splintered. On the third strike, the door flew open, torn from its hinges. The apartment was tiny, barely more than a single room. It was cluttered and grim, and there, on a futon in the corner, was Yumi. Her blindfold had been removed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning hope. Fumio Onuki stood frozen in the middle of the room, a kitchen knife in his hand. His face a grotesque mask of shock and fury. For a moment, he seemed poised to lunge towards Yumi. The officers leveled their weapons. "Drop it," Sato commanded, his voice booming in the small space. "It's over." The fight went out of Onuki's eyes. The knife clattered to the floor. He slumped to his knees, a pathetic, defeated figure. No longer a phantom, no longer a ghost on the wire. Just a man. A quiet, unremarkable man who lived in apartment 402, the devil next door. Officers rushed to Yumi, cutting the ropes from her wrists, wrapping her in a blanket. She was shaking uncontrollably, but she was alive. She was safe. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Yumi was reunited with her parents in a tearful, desperate embrace that seemed to contain all the anguish and terror of the past week. Fumio Onuki was taken into custody, his quiet confession revealing a motive as banal as it was chilling. He was in debt from gambling. He had seen Yumi walking home from school, and in a moment of cold, calculated desperation, saw her not as a person, but as a solution to his financial problems. He had no prior record. He was just a neighbor, a face in the crowd.
The case of the Chitose high school girl abduction became a landmark in Japanese criminal justice. It was a triumph of technology and old-fashioned police work, a testament to the dogged determination of Detective Sato and his team. The successful phone trace, a feat of incredible skill and luck, would go on to inform and revolutionize police procedures for decades to come. But for the city of Chitose, something was lost that could never be recovered. The illusion of safety was gone, replaced by a chilling new awareness. The winter of 1975 left a permanent scar on the town's psyche. The snows would return every year, blanketing the city in white, but it would never again look quite so pure. The residents would look at their neighbors, at the quiet, unremarkable faces in the crowd, and wonder. They had learned the most terrifying lesson of all, that monsters don't always have fangs and claws. Sometimes they live just down the hall. And sometimes the most frightening sound in the world is the silence of a ghost who knows your name.